Further on the banning of the Simply Living article, I should inform Macca that the student newspaper at Queensland University has also republished the article. Basically, the way we decided to fight the ban in Queensland, what happened was they banned Simply Living. They didn't ban the article. So we republished the article, challenged them to ban us, which they didn't do, and we then said we'd be encouraging other student newspapers to, other student newspapers and other magazines to republish the article, and we've actually got Semper Floriat's republished it. And again, the government sort of retreated from that. There was also a bookseller in Brisbane, Brian Laver, who sold the Simply Living articles from his bookshop, Emma's. He was informed that he faced an $18,000 fine and 12 months in prison for selling that issue of Simply Living. He just said, well, okay, I believe in civil liberties and I'm quite prepared to accept that. If you want to arrest me, you can. And again, they withdrew, they retreated. Essentially what they were trying to do is just put it over us. Like, they can only get away with these things as long as we let them. If we stand up to them and are prepared to take them on, they haven't got the number of jails or the number of cells to contain us. And I think that's a very important point, because although Hemp is pursuing a number of different strategies to change the laws, we're pursuing, obviously, at the moment, an educational campaign, which is why we've republished this book, and we've invited Jack out here. We will be considering electoral strategies later on, but I think probably the most effective way is civil disobedience. And in terms of civil disobedience, the two best actions we've had were the April Fool's Day protest in Nimbin and the October 21 smoke-in at Brisbane. Now, what happened in both those things was we went out determined to get mass arrests. Like at Nimbin on April Fool's Day, we decided we'd play an April Fool's joke on the police. So we went up 300 or 400 of us, led by Bob Hopkins, who was dressed as the Fool. Bob knocked on the door of the police station at Nimbin, smoking a joint, asked to be arrested, and we lined up behind him to get arrested. Now, the police response to that was quite interesting. Like, they actually had 12 to 15 police at Nimbin that day, when normally they have 2 or 3, and they locked themselves in the Nimbin police station. We sat in the grounds of the Nimbin police station eating marijuana cookies, smoking joints. People clambered up on the roof and sort of put various slogans and banners up on the police station, and waited for them. It took them about half an hour to process Bob. They took him, as soon as he knocked on the door, what they did is they pulled him inside, shut the door. And then sort of spent about half an hour talking to him, just getting his details, etc., and saying they might process him later, which they did, but that's another story. And in that sort of 2 or 3 hours while we were there waiting to get mass arrests, they actually only let 2 or 3 of us actually get into the police station to try and get mass arrests. Now, so that was the first time we used the mass arrest strategy. The second time was the October 21 demonstration in Brisbane. And the way that worked was this. Essentially, we again sort of approached the media and told them we were out to get mass arrests because we wanted to mount a challenge to the laws in Queensland. And about 2 days before, I went to see the police to arrange the various formalities which one does when arranging a large demonstration. And I went to see the inspector in charge of the city police station in Brisbane and told him that we were going to have a march to Parliament, and I said we were going to have a smoke-in outside Parliament. And he said, "Oh, you can't do that. We'll have to arrest you if you do that." And I said, "That's great, because that's what we want to happen. We want all of us to be arrested so we can mount a challenge to the laws." And at that stage, the cops were sort of quite taken back, and he said, "Well, what will you do if we don't arrest you?" And I said, well, that's going to be very, well, you can try that, but we'll try and make it very hard for you not to arrest us. So on October 21, that's what we did. We marched with 2,000 people, which is the biggest demonstration we've had in Brisbane. It was our most successful one. The fact that we were having a smoke-in really drew people out, and the fact that people knew that we were going down there to force mass arrest drew people out. So we went down there with 2,000 people, and we had a sort of batting line-up. We had about various people who were going to get arrested. Tony Knipe and Roger Brand were our openers, and I came in at number 3. And Tony lit up, got arrested, Roger lit up and got arrested, and then it was my turn. So I lit up, and I walked across to the inspector and said, okay, it's my turn, now arrest me. And at this stage he said, well, I'm afraid, John, the situation of arrests has finished. And I got outraged. I said, this is discrimination. You've arrested my friends for smoking dope, and here I am, and at this stage I was standing in the middle of the police line with the inspector. There was about 10, 20 police all around me. I was there, I had a joint in my hand, and I was smoking it, and I was asking to be arrested. And they refused to arrest me, and Inspector Wall sort of, maintained that he wasn't going to arrest me. So all that I could do was I just sat there, and while the various photographers photographed me, I just smoked a joint, standing in the middle of the police lines. And that was then the front page story of the paper that day, the next day, and it was, again, very successful, although, again, we weren't able to force mass arrests, and both times we've gone out with that strategy, we've failed. Like in Brisbane, even with 2,000 people smoking joints outside Parliament, a place you'd think they'd want to protect, and with me, the third person, actually going into the police line, smoking a joint, talking to the police inspector, begging to get arrested, we just were unable to force mass arrests. So I think that's quite interesting, and I think it is an example of what, what could be what I'd like to call the coup de grace. And the way I sort of, fantasise the coup de grace happening is that we just don't do it in one city. We just don't turn up with 2,000 people in one city. We do it in as many cities as possible as we can. And I think we should choose the police headquarters next time. While we were actually doing this in Brisbane in October 21, it was the first National Day of Action in South Australia. South Australian Hemp actually had a smoke-in in the police headquarters. They were having a march to Parliament, and Parliament, I don't know the situation in Adelaide, but as you march from Elizabeth Square to Parliament, you can actually duck into police headquarters in Angus Street, which is what they did, and they had a smoke-in there, which is the first smoke-in that's ever been held in a police headquarters in Australia. So I figure that that's perhaps what we should do for the coup de grace, if we can build the political will. Because if we have the political will to try and force mass arrests, they have not got the political will to resist us. They are aware that a large number of people being arrested will mean that they'll have to have a lot of jail cells and prison cells for us. They are aware we're going to tie up quite a lot of court time, and they are aware if we're determined not to pay the fines and determined to go to prison, we can totally destroy their prison system. So the laws operate on our consent. They are quite prepared to pick us up in our homes one by one, but if in mass and if in force we are prepared in one large operation to challenge their laws, they cannot enforce them. Well, that went on a lot for longer than I intended. Actually, I'm here to talk about this book, Hemp and the Marijuana Conspiracy, which is what we've retitled The Emperor Wears No Clothes for the Australian edition. It is the same text as the 10th American edition, but what it's got as well is an essay I've written called Hemp and the Marijuana Conspiracy in Australia. Now, I'll explain the cover of it. The cover's fairly simple. It's got a convict working in the hemp fields. This is Australia circa 1800. There's a convict working in the hemp fields while a soldier, British guard, overlooks him, and in the forefront you can see one of the hemp plants has escaped from the hemp fields and is turning feral and is turning into a marijuana plant. It's sort of starting to branch out and is starting to assume that form rather than the straight sort of hemp look. And in many ways that's the history of hemp in Australia. While researching things like the Hunter Valley crop, which is, largely we don't know much about the history of hemp in Australia, and that's why we've included this essay in it. But in Australia in 1964, it was discovered, there was a huge hemp crop, Indian hemp crop, discovered growing in the Hunter Valley. Now, it was extensive. It covered something like, they calculated, 600 acres. There were patches 80 acres in extent, and there were several other patches 12 acres in extent. Now, it was obviously too large to have been planted by someone. A, no one smoked marijuana in Australia in those days, and B, no one has ever managed to cultivate a crop 80 acres in extent in Australia during the past 60 years of marijuana prohibition. So it was a mystery as to where that crop came from. Some people at the time claimed it was Chinese market gardeners and that the crop had escaped from there. Other people said it was just wild hemp which had escaped from birdseed. So when I began the book, I knew a few things about the history of hemp in Australia, and I knew that the Hunter Valley crop was quite crucial, because if you look at how marijuana smoking starts in Australia, it actually starts from the Hunter Valley crop. The first weed ever smoked in Australia was from a group who were called the Weed Raiders. Like, as soon as they discovered this huge infestation of Indian hemp, the newspapers spread this information about what a terrible and evil sex drug marijuana was. Sex drug, oh, I might want to try this. And so they went out and they actually started locating various patches of this stuff, and they started smoking it. And from that, these weed raiders, as they were called, spread the practice of marijuana smoking all up and down the East Coast. Largely it was the surfy community who did it. All right, okay, so while researching that, I discovered that the Hunter Valley crop, in fact, had been the first sighting of the Hunter Valley crop, which I was able to discover, was in 1844 in a very interesting book called I think the Treatise of Flax and Hemp, by a guy called Dr. Francis Campbell. And so I knew that the crop which they exterminated in the Hunter Valley, and they actually did exterminate that crop after 5 years in 1969, I knew that it had actually been sighted 150 years ago. So I went back to investigate that. And in investigating that, what I discovered, I was after who planted it. And I think I have, if you read the book, I think I know who planted the original Hunter Valley crop, and that's what my investigations have discovered. But I discovered, I think, something even greater. I think what I discovered was that Australia was originally intended as a hemp colony, that the reason that the British settled Australia was because of the hemp crisis of 1780. And again, if you read the book, I think I've proved that beyond a shadow of a doubt, and it's incredibly well documented. Any sort of Australian historian who wants to take me on, of the convicts only one, I think will have hard trouble refuting it. Okay, and the other thing in the book, what it concludes with, is the Reefer Madness campaign of 1938. Essentially, what that was a Harry J. Anslinger inspired evil sex drug sort of campaign in Australia. I've got to wind up very shortly, but I'll read you some of the things which some of the quotes from the Reefer Madness campaign of 1938 in Australia. And the first one was the one from Smith's Weekly called "Drug That Maddens Victims. Plant grows wild in Queensland. Warning from America." A Mexican drug that drives men and women to the wildest excesses has made its first appearances in Australia. It distorts moral values and leads to degrading sexual extravagances. It is called marijuana. Marijuana is obtained from a plant, brackets, cannabis sativa, that has been discovered growing wild in many of the coastal parts of Queensland. Anyway, so interestingly, the way reefer madness was sold in Australia was as an evil sex drug. In America, where, if you look at Jack's book, it was sold as a killer drug, a drug which caused violence by essentially blacks and Mexicans against whites. So it shows that Jack sort of has an offer in his book for $30,000 for anyone to prove him wrong. I'm really upset he hasn't got one for $30,000 for someone who'd prove him right, because I think I do prove him right in this book, in the Australian section. I think, you know, I prove right his claim that hemp was the most important crop in the 18th century, and it was so important that Australia was founded as a hemp colony. And I think I prove the marijuana conspiracy is true, and it's even true in Australia, and it's true in sort of surprising ways. Anyway, so that's the book, Hemp and the Marijuana Conspiracy, which contains The Emperor Wears No Clothes and my essay, Hemp and the Marijuana Conspiracy in Australia. It's on sale at the back of the hall for $20.
Thanks very much, John. Now,